Hi, I'm Tony.
I'm Patrick.
And welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. Today we're going to start a brand new book that we're kind of excited about. Mm-hmm. It's one that has been put together based on Greg Bahnsen's lecture. It's called Against All Opposition, Defending the Christian Worldview. And if you don't know Greg Bahnsen or haven't heard of him, you are missing out on a treat. This guy was tremendously, he was brilliant, right? He kind of pushed presuppositionalism to the forefront during the time that he was writing and debating and speaking and that sort of thing. And Gary DeMar has put together a series of Bahnsen's lectures that he did for the American Vision, and he put together those lectures in this particular book. And so we want to spend some time kind of looking at the ideas that Greg Bahnsen has put out, especially with regard to presuppositional apologetics. So the book begins with a preface by Gary DeMar, and he says at the center of every worldview is what might be called the touchstone proposition, right? So a proposition is a statement that's either true or false, right? So that's the idea of, what he's getting at here. The basic proposition, a statement that is, is kind of the we might say the thesis statement, right? So a touchstone proposition, and here it is, of the worldview, right? So the center of every worldview is what might be called, he says, the touchstone proposition of that worldview. It's a proposition that is held to be the fundamental truth about reality and serves as a criterion to determine which other propositions may or may not count as candidates for belief, right? So it's the key, it's the touchstone, it's the major idea. And everything else, all the rest of the truths or statements or propositions kind of center around this touchstone proposition, right?
Yeah, it's the ultimate standard. It's the swinging door. It's the things that you'll let in and say, oh, yep, this agrees with me, or this is the things to keep out and say, I don't agree with this, and here are the reasons why, because the things aren't able to kind of cross the threshold. And we talked about this with our book, How to Be an Atheist, by Mitch Stokes, Dr. Mitch Stokes, and he talks about that everyone has this. The most nerdiest of all scientists who doesn't trespass into the world of politics or department politics or anything. He just wants to sit there with his beakers and lab kits and reams full of data, and he looks at that data with an understanding that there are things that he can let in and things that he can't, he won't allow to come in. Right. Because
that are unacceptable based on how he views the way the world works. Right?
And this isn't a denial of reality here. It's presuppositions or ideas that come in. So the idea that the world is flat is not a way that NASA scientists can let come in, or their calculations will be off and they won't be able to get people to and from the International Space Station. And so those ideas aren't allowed to kind of cross that threshold. It's not part of their ultimate standard that they allow, because they're unable to then work within the framework of that kind of second step is establishing your foundation and then building upon it and doing things with it. And so that's what's being talked about here. So DeMar goes on to say that defending the Christian worldview against unbelieving thought takes an understanding that every worldview has a centralized guiding principle that serves as a foundational operational assumption about the nature of reality. Is it real?
So this is kind of a metaphysical claim, right? Every worldview has a metaphysics, right? The nature of reality type of thing that it takes as basic to what the way the world is and how it operates and that sort of thing. And I think that's what he's getting at here, right?
Yeah. Is it all a simulation? Is it all just in my mind, or is reason and logic just there as a human construct that works, or is there something more to that?
Is it physical? Or is, is all the world physical, just a material type of world, or are there non-physical elements of the world, that kind of stuff? Those are, kind of basic guiding principles of a person's worldview.
Right. Morality. The clash of human history is a clash between different standards of morality. Genghis Khan, versus the Chinese population that he brutalized and conquered and overtook in more ways than one. You have George Washington who operates on power not being grabbed completely, and the more ethical point of view is to give it away after 8 years or whatever. Yeah. So depending on which area of reality you're talking about, these things come into play. But then at the very foundation of it all is kind of where we want to point to and where it starts. So Christians tend to attack symptoms, the rotten fruit of unbelieving thought, he calls it, rather than expose the root that gives life to a tree. So you might have someone that says, oh, Jesus never existed. Here's 72 different articles talking about how Jesus existed. We're very confident. There's a high probability, according to whatever model, it comes to 1 or close to 1, and we're more confident in it than not. And so I'm going to kind of shotgun approach and try and take the hill that way by just throwing numbers at it. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to kind of do that. But when that becomes the only basis for how we do it, or there's actually a better way to do it, which is to talk about things like the knowledge of history. And okay, so Jesus never existed. How do you understand history? Are we able to know things that happened yesterday or before the age of the video camera? Or are we just all liars, and there's no one that is able to be accurate with the understanding of history? And so those things, again, you, instead of confronting the opposition that way, you take a step back and say, okay, what are the foundation underlying beliefs of that statement that's being put forth? And so that's the one where we can, he says, expose the root. And so we have a better understanding of what that person's idea of what history is, then we can then go on to inform them and talk about the competing views of history. The Bible says that the axe is already laid at the root of the trees, with the result that every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire.
Right. And so instead of tackling this, the symptoms, he's suggesting we go toward the root, the fundamental operational assumption of the particular worldview that we're considering, right? And so he begins by saying that the biblical apologetics means to offer a defense, right? That's apologia, that's the word here. And it's practiced in different ways by Christians. Some Christian apologists, he tells us, try to appeal to skeptics by presenting a boatload of facts. And that's what you were talking about just a minute ago, right? With this evidential method, he tells us the claim is made that facts are neutral and speak for themselves. And so here are the facts, here are the facts, here are the facts. Can't you see what they're saying?
Dug up a bone in the dirt.
That's right.
We can all see it.
Yeah.
And therefore we know
it's 1 billion years old.
Yeah, it's true. It's true because it is.
Or it was put there yesterday.
Right. Made in China.
He says others believe that reason alone, so not just evidential facts, right, what we see in the world, but reason alone, devoid of any prior presuppositions, he says is an impossibility, is the best way to defend the faith. So we defend the faith by either presenting facts, these evidential claims, right? Here's the evidence, or we defend the faith by reason alone, and without any prior presuppositions. And so those are at least a couple of approaches that he suggests Christians attempt to do, right?
Right. That's the route we should want to take is having an understanding that we all have presuppositions. So let's talk about them. Let's figure out where we exist in relationship to each other with those starting points, because then we can build upon that and see where we stand so that we can talk about them. And so presuppositionalism, kind of what's talked about in the proper, is getting back to those sources of things like the nature of reality, reason, ethics, or reason, logic, and then ethics as well. And so having that as a starting point will help us lay a better foundation for a discussion where it's not just saying, okay, I'll give you everybody, including, the entire world of Christian skeptics. And so let me prove from there my ideas. Well, you might only be able to get then a little point. And he's saying, you don't have to go that far. Let's take a step back and say, if this world is created by God, then all facts are God's facts. And so there's not a these are my facts, these are your facts for your position. All of them speak to it. And so we want to talk and draw the biggest circle around it, which is everything.
The heavens declare the glory of God, right?
Yeah.
So that's everything.
Visible, invisible, under the earth, above the earth.
Yeah.
So even scientists admit that factual neutrality and reason alone approaches are impossible because the practice of science rests upon a number of presuppositions about the nature of reality, and we usually take that for granted.
Yeah, so we take for granted the fact that we can know things. We take for granted the orderliness of nature and what we see and that sort of thing. We take it for granted that this experiment that we did yesterday, if we did it again, it'll happen the same way today, right? We just kind of assume that those are presuppositional assumptions about the way the world works, and without them, we could do very little science, or at least we wouldn't even be motivated to do science. Right? If we thought that the world was just chaotic and anything could happen, then we couldn't come up with any scientific principles and laws because we wouldn't think there are any, right?
Yeah, even the collection of data in my philosophy of science class, we talked about this kind of theoretical scientist who was super smart, and so he decided what he was going to do for the rest of his life until he was 80 years old was to write everything that he possibly observed or seen or did, and he would write it all down, and then at the end of his 80 years, he would give them over to the scientific community and say, "Here, you're welcome." And they would look at it and go, "This says nothing. I mean, these are observations, but we don't know what point they're driving to. We don't know what understanding you're coming from. The data out there is fine, but you need kind of that filter to let out the things that don't inform anything about what you're observing. How much water is in the ocean isn't going to tell you the makeup of Betelgeuse in the Orion constellation. And so having that is fine, but it's not something that is helpful. And so this kind of approach will help to kind of orientate yourself in an understanding of, okay, exactly what lens am I supposed to be looking through it, rather than every lens or no lens or whatever it is. No one comes to any idea with that. You have your presuppositions, and it's always good to kind of take a look at those presuppositions and make sure that they're in accord with what you actually believe. But that's one of the points that I think debate within that field brings out well as well. So certain operating assumptions are assumed. Otherwise, no science or communication can take place.
Right.
I believe that I can talk to you. I'm talking to you, dear viewer, right now. Can you understand me? Well, I'm going to assume so. Why? Well, because you've clicked on a video. It's in English. You've continued to get to this point. And so we can have an assumption that not only are you listening to this in a language you understand, but there are ideas by these mouth movements that I'm making and vocal cord movements that correspond with things out in the world that you can relate to. So that's one of those things where even communication has an assumption. The issue, however, is how to account for these prior assumptions and how they fit within the context of, for us, a biblical worldview. That's what Greg Bahnsen's Against All Opposition does from start to finish.
Yeah.
From the Roman numerals to the very end of the page.
And so Gary DeMar tells us that the Bible shows that apologetics and worldviews in general deal with fundamental assumptions that guide reason and give meaning to facts. Right? A fact becomes evidence that is meaningful when it's applied to a particular theory, right? Otherwise, it's just something that happens, right? So evidence is when you take a fact and you say, I believe this is the case. Here is this fact, and it, increases the probability of my theories. something like that, right? So that's what we mean by evidence. So we use apologetics, he tells us, every day, right? Every time we defend our view of a subject over the opinions of others, he says, we are practicing apologetics. It's no less true in the defense of the Christian faith as against all oppositions. And he talks about Paul on Mars Hill, right? He says Paul makes his defense of the Christian worldview in Athens by confronting a worldview based on Greek philosophy. So notice, Paul was confronting a worldview, how they viewed the world, what their basic assumptions were about the way the world is or was and how it operated. And so Paul offers an apologia, that's our word for apologetics, right? A defense of the Christian worldview over against the prevailing Greek worldview. That's what Paul was doing. He was making this contrast and showing how the Christian worldview was superior to the Greek worldview in Acts chapter 17.
Yeah. To the unknown God, I will reveal the unknown God to you. Guess what? It's our God. And in fact, all these other gods are false gods. Here's the real one, the one that you're not worshiping. And the reason that they laugh at him, some do, is because he talks about the resurrection of the dead. And so they assumed that all of life is kind of this veil. It's all evil, and really it's only the kind of the spiritual world that houses everything. So when you die, that's the ultimate glory is going to Sheol and living from there a good life. And so there's no resurrection of the dead. Again, there's the assumption. There's the clash of the assumptions. And there were some that listened to him, and there were some that believed, and there were some that confronted their assumptions with that and wanted to. And so that's what the end of that story entails for us. DeMar goes on to say that the mind is designed by God for a kind of 5 areas. 1 is reason, 2 is to test, another is to investigate, another one is to examine, and the 5th is to accumulate knowledge through the study of the Bible, creation, history, experience, and everything else, but within certain interpretive first principles that we call presuppositions. So this is kind of the undertaking of the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview says God created all things. He fashions his creation in a certain way, and then he creates humans in a very special way and imbues them with certain traits that he holds. And there's nothing apart from his communication or understanding or the way he has ordered the world that we can escape and get away from. And so some of those areas are these 5 things. We can accumulate knowledge. We have a sense that we can trust our memories, that we can look at the world, we can know it now, and we can know it in the future, and then we can be confident of the things that we knew back then. We can reason from certain things. So there looks like there's traffic in the street. I'm going to safely assume there's traffic in the street. And so all these things are the touchstone, the ultimate worldview, the ultimate standard that we go back to as the touchstone. We are commanded to test the spirits, to test all things, 1 John 4:1, to examine everything and hold fast to which is good, 1 Corinthians 5:21. Christian apologists give reasons as to why they believe what they know is true. So even in the context of the Christian worldview, we have the ability and the direction to accumulate and to give out that source of information. We're told to preach the gospel. That's the saving power of humanity, but it's also how we can know the world around us, and it gives us a proper understanding. So.
Yeah, and so then after that, he kind of makes a really, really important point here. He says that in a biblical defense of the Christian faith, God is not the one on trial, right? And I'm always reminded of that C.S. Lewis
God
book.
in the docks.
Yeah, God in the docks. And he says that's not the case, right? He says, how can a finite, fallible, fallen creature, ever be in a position to competently judge eternal things, right? How is it possible that the creature can legitimately question the creator? This, kind of echoes back to the questions that God asked Job, right? In the book, near the end of the book of Job. So the Christian apologist, he tells us, is not given the option to adopt a neutral position when defending the faith. Neutrality assumes that man and God are kind of on the same equal footing, right? God is here, I'm here, and we're kind of, we can argue together, right? He says, no. Christians are commanded not to, he calls this foolish, right? Christians are commanded not to answer a fool according to his folly. Why not? Well, if we try to do this, he tells us, we'll be like the fool, right? In his misguided assumptions, and be classified a fool if we assume neutrality or use his operating assumptions. Proverbs 26:4. The Bible assumes that worldviews based on premises that are contrary to the Bible are foolishness, right? And so we don't want to do that, is what he's suggesting here. We don't want to try to stand on a faulty, foolish foundation in our attempt to defend what God has to say.
Right. And the opposition doesn't stand in the dock or in the place of judgment and says, 51% of me says I'm more convinced that God exists than not. I'll accept him. What they do is they stand in the very lap of God and try and smack him in the face. That's the ultimate word picture that we can get here. And I like C.S. Lewis as much as the next person, if not a little bit more. And his book on miracles is a presuppositional book, whether he wanted to believe so or not. We go on to say that an apologetic methodology that claims a Christian should be open and objective and tolerant of all opinions when he defends the faith is like a person who hopes to stop a man from committing suicide by taking the 100-story plunge with him, hoping to convince the lost soul on his way down. No one in his right mind would make such a concession to foolishness.
So
we don't want to join.
Right? How do we convince the person to not hit the bottom after they jump? Well, we jump with them and then try to say, you really shouldn't be jumping. Yeah. It's going to, hurt or kill you. And let me try to convince you not to, No. He says that's not what we do. We don't get on their ground in an attempt to do this.
Yeah. Right? Think about if you're in a debate, whether, a friendly rivalry or a legitimate one in front of 1,000 people. And the topic of the debate is, did the Red Sea split for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea? Okay. What you need to do to be reasonable is to put down your Bible, to not talk about it, and to prove to the audience and to the other person that this happened. So we can kind of talk about, the Israelites were in the region at the time. There are certain known effects that can happen from time to time where winds blow and silt can build up, where you can kind of get this idea of walking across. Yeah.
Or even worse, we can say, well, the Egyptians really had no record of this, and so can we really, accept this because there is no real written. I mean, there's the Bible, but there's no Egyptian written record of this, and so did it really happen, kind of thing, right? Yeah.
And so what they're asking you to do is, okay, put down your belief about who God is, that he operates, that he takes an interest in a specific people group, that he is able to interact with his creation. Lay all that aside and then prove to me. Why would I say I believe this because of this if I'm just going to lay it down? That's putting myself at not just a disadvantage, but I'm essentially lying to the person. And so what I'm asking, what I'm doing by not putting those presuppositions down is I'm just meeting that person on their same level, in that we both hold to certain presuppositions, to certain ideas, that we approach different avenues of facts, and those facts becomes evidence in certain ways. And my burden is I have to make all things evidence for my position because God controls everything. And so I have to be really, really smart, or that's where faith comes into play there, that trust. But Christians do this all the time, and when they adopt the operating presuppositions of unbelieving thought as if they were neutral assumptions about reality, there's no neutrality of assumptions. We can get to a common level of neutrality in that we're all created in the image of God. We're all able to observe things, but even the act of observation is something that you would be in disagreement with someone who's a materialist. Well, I observe these things and we can pull truth facts from them. Well, the materialist would say, well, all we're able to grab are things that are beneficial for our survival. And so if I'm being consistent with my standard, I don't know those are true things. I know those are survivable knowledge things that at least to the point where we're at as a species and as an organism that I am, I may be a better evolved by a monicum. And so I'm able to trust this observation more, but we're only able to know the truth from it because of survivability. You want to say that there's some esoteric, fuller understanding of truth that resides out there, that thing will remain there even if we're gone. Okay. That's the presuppositions that we're coming into to butt heads with, and so we just want to be open and honest about that, and then observe that and say, can we look at first principles to say, are we able to operate with those assumptions, and what do those assumptions lead to? Those are kind of our two questions. All right. So Greg Bahnsen's Against All Opposition is the definitive apologetic starting point to help Christians develop a sound biblical apologetic methodology. So again, an intro book. That is there to kind of lead us into an idea of looking at a biblical worldview, biblical foundations, and the presuppositions that we have or should have that maybe you haven't kind of realized yet that flow out of your announcement that you're a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. And so that takes us to the end of his preface, and now we want to move to the introduction to the book. Yep. Right? So let's spend just a few minutes here on his introduction so that we can get a feel for where he's headed here, and then we'll jump into chapter 1. So he begins the introduction by kind of a story. He says, in February 1973, Jesus Christ redeemed me in a darkly lit pub in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He says, I was in the final months of my senior year at Western Michigan University. Go Broncos, right? He says, my athletic career had faltered a few years before, and I performed just well enough to keep his scholarship. So that's where he was when the Lord met him. He was in this, kind of pub, and he was talking to one of his friends, right?
Right, so he says his friend Bill drove him to the meet. He did his athletic thing, and then spent the next few hours just randomly going around Ann Arbor, in a pub where he ended up hearing the gospel. The story that he tells is one of you wouldn't believe it if it didn't actually happen type deal. My life changed in an instant, he says, as he headed back to the house where he was living with a drug dealer, a vagrant that looked like Charles Manson, and a few other disreputable occupants.
Wow.
So he says, as expected, his Christian faith became an issue because he lacked the ability to offer a coherent defense. He doesn't know what to do now.
Right. And so what he does here is he graduated from college a few months later, and then within a year, he was a student at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi.
A little bit what we saw with Mitch Stokes' story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he just jumps into seminary because he wants answers, right? And he says, he was taking courses in Greek and Hebrew and systematic theology and church history and hermeneutics and apologetics and all these types of things, in seminary. And it was at Reformed Theological Seminary that he met Greg Bahnsen, right? Bahnsen was an associate professor of apologetics and ethics, and Bahnsen at the time was working on his PhD.
Right. So over time, they worked together on some conferences, publishing projects, and his book, Always Ready, Bahnsen's book, Always Ready, includes articles that he wrote for the American Vision's Biblical Worldview magazine. Mm-hmm. For 3 years, Greg spoke at American Vision's week-long preparation conferences in the 90s.
Right. And so now, he says we come to Against All Opposition, the book that we have here. He says not long ago, he started listening to talks that Greg gave at the American Vision's conference, the Second Life Preparation Conference. He says he was struck with how fundamentally basic and impacting the material was. Many books dealing with biblical apologetics, he suggests, assumes too much, from the reader, right? Greg was kind of basic, right, and understandable. He says most Christians don't have the time or inclination to study the topic in depth. right? And so,
To make biblical apologetics accessible to more Christians, especially young people, American Vision decided to transcribe and edit the lectures and publish them in a way that would benefit a growing interest in biblical apologetics from a presuppositional perspective. Even, again, the term presuppositionalism, if you haven't taken a philosophy class or kind of dealt with it, you might kind of grit your teeth and go, oh, presuppositions. Assumptions before you make the your actual assumptions of what you're talking about. So that's what this book intends to do. American Vision's long-term goal is to continue and enhance the legacy of the work of Greg Bahnsen to the glory of God and the advancement of his kingdom. And Tony and I were looking at just Bahnsen's plethora of lectures and talks and everything that's available on sermon audio. And I mean, just pulling out books from his topics on his lectures are still there. So, right. I've listened to other presuppositional people say, "Oh, I've got most of my training in presuppositionalism not from school or from taking classes, but it's from going through Bahnsen's library and just listening and thinking it over and reading different articles about something that hit or didn't hit." And so I think that's a pretty impressive legacy for somebody who we would say, oh, he died at the prime of his life. He was, the Michael Jordan right before, the first championship. And he may have gotten a ring, but, I'm sure 7 would happen after that. But we just never know. And the fact that he's still so impactful with the audio quality that we do have is interesting and has spawned out from there of still greater interest. It didn't die with Bahnsen. It didn't die with Van Til, and people are interacting with his stuff and making more out of it. And it's exactly what the church should be doing, of building these legacies from people in the church.
Yeah. And so he says that the American Vision's long-term goal is to continue and enhance the legacy of Dr. Greg Bahnsen to the glory of God and advancement of his kingdom. And he ends his introduction here by quoting Bahnsen in his Presuppositional Apologetics, stated and defended. Bahnsen says, "We must not be satisfied to present Christianity as the most reasonable position to hold among the competing options available. Rather, the Christian faith is the only reasonable outlook available to men." And so that's kind of the position, the stance that he takes, right?
Right?
It's the only one that works,
yeah,
right?
It's not the close approximation. We'll eventually get there. No, this is the only one.
Yeah.
And so that, dear Christian, is your job as well, is to always be prepared to give a response that entails only one answer that incorporates all of everything that has ever existed, will exist, or has happened. And so things like, what about evil, is in there. And so not explicitly stated in presuppositional form or critique, but Christensen's book is very presuppositional because it does what? It doesn't start with man and reasons up, but it starts with the idea of God exists, what's in the Bible is true, and what do we see from there? And so do we have an explanation for why there is evil? You can be the person that says, oh, why did this bad thing happen? And slap God in the face. This is evil. How dare you? But you're only able to do that because you have an idea of what evil is, and you're sitting on your creator's lap and slapping and trying to slap him in the face.
Yeah. Wow. That's
so good luck.
Yeah.
As you join us in Against All Opposition, Defending the Christian Worldview by Greg Bahnsen, and with very special thanks to Gary DeMar and American Vision for putting this out, and for all those people that released their copyrights so that we can have Bahnsen's words with us. Again, there are 3 books in this series so far: Against All Opposition, and then Impossibility of the Contrary, and Pushing the Antithesis. Pushing the Antithesis was out before, but they've republished it and included it into this pack. Not sure if we're going to do these 3, but looking at just the topics for the other 2, because I've already read Against All Opposition and put all my little sticky notes and chapter breakdowns in here of notes of the major points. it's not outside the possibility, but the coverage that is entailed in all the other ones. If you have these three books, you've got a very good grasp of presuppositionalism, how to respond, and what about when they answer back? And so all of those kind of topics are included in those three books. So we're just covering the first one, Against All Oppositions. You can get it in the link below that's provided at American Vision. And hopefully you'll join us next time as we dig into Chapter 1 of Greg Bahnsen's lecture book series.
See you next time.